Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise after my colleague, the honourable member from Louis Saint Laurent. He brings both knowledge and passion to this House, and we're very fortunate to have him on the team. Watching the reckless spending of this Liberal government, in his 2.5 years here, he's raised repeatedly the fact that the Liberal Party of Canada broke their core election promise to Canadians, which was that they would balance the budget over the course of their mandate and never run a deficit of more than $10 billion, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister and the Finance Minister broke that central promise within a few months of forming government. And this budget shows they haven't learned the lessons, Mr. Speaker. The most troubling quote from the budget delivered a short time ago by the Minister of Finance was near the end of his speech when he said, I quote, "With this budget, we are doubling down on our plan to invest in the middle class and people working hard to join it," end quote. Now, the middle class and those working hard to join it is the trope that they throw out all the time, Mr. Speaker. The Fraser Institute has shown that the middle class are paying more under the Liberal government. 80 to 90% of middle-class families are paying more. So despite the rhetoric, and we have a Prime Minister who specializes in rhetoric, their record is atrocious. They are doubling down, Mr. Speaker. It's a quintessential Liberal double-double. Deficits and debt, Mr. Speaker. And we know deficits are future taxes. So what this government has committed Canada to is a long-term structural deficit going out to 2030 that will start piling up debt on our children, on Canadians' grandchildren, that will almost double the debt over the projections from the Department of Finance, and guarantee more tax increases in the future, Mr. Speaker. Actually, the semantics of the Liberal government are critical to watch because they use language. I was just at Immigration Committee where the first time I've ever heard the Immigration Minister use the term illegal border crossers. He likes to say they're irregular, Mr. Speaker. Well, his own department is suggesting Canadians will be spending up to $3 billion on these irregular crossers because the Liberals won't fix the Safe Third Country Agreement, Mr. Speaker. The word invest, in the minister's quote that I read, he's going to double down on investments. They use the word invest 456 times in this budget, Mr. Speaker. For comparison, they mention the Canadian Armed Forces, 0. So it shows their priorities. That's the largest department of the federal government. Just this morning, the Minister of Defence and Foreign Affairs committed our Canadian Armed Forces in an awkward and incomprehensible way to a mission in Mali, Mr. Speaker, at a time where 162 UN peacekeepers have died in Mali because it's a combat zone, not a peacekeeping mission, Mr. Speaker. The Canadian Armed Forces, our men and women, were mentioned 0 in this budget. But investment, which is code language for spending, Mr. Speaker, is mentioned 456 times. They've doubled down on excessive spending, excessive deficits, debt, and higher taxes for Canadians. The election promise they made that I started my remarks out with, the Prime Minister of Canada changed the Liberal Party's view on deficits midway through an election campaign. He had said previously they were the party of Paul Martin, but then when he wanted to outfox the NDP, he said, no, we're going to run deficits because we're in a recession. Well, there was no recession, Mr. Speaker. He either didn't understand the economy or misled Canadians. They then said, we won't run a deficit any more than $10 billion. As I said, they broke that promise within months, Mr. Speaker. Their first 2 deficits had deficits in the $20 billion plus range, almost $30 billion, Mr. Speaker. We're still doubling their projected goals at a time the economy is doing well. This is not a time you run massive deficits, because I said, Mr. Speaker, those are future taxes on Canadians that are going to slow our economy down and hurt middle-class families. They have increased spending in a little over 2 years, Mr. Speaker, by $58 billion. It's really unparalleled, even compared to the previous Trudeau Prime Minister, who I can mention by name because I'm speaking about Pierre Trudeau. It's almost unparalleled in 2 years, 20% increase in spending during an economic positive growth period. Are Canadian families better off, 20% better off? My friend from Welland is crying out. I know the people in Welland aren't 20% better off. I know they didn't vote for $30 billion deficits. They didn't vote for higher taxes on families, higher taxes on small business, higher taxes through CPP premiums, higher taxes through a carbon tax. In Welland, in Cobourg, in Kingston, they didn't vote for that. They voted for the promise of no more than a $10 billion deficit, Mr. Speaker. I'd recommend, rather than heckling, some of the Liberal members go into the coffee shops in their ridings, where people think a double-double is cream and sugar, not double deficits, double spending. The Liberal double-double, Mr. Speaker, is coming at a time that the U.S. economy is cutting taxes on small business. This Prime Minister and Finance Minister waged a war last year on small business, Mr. Speaker, and are increasing a carbon tax at a time we're already uncompetitive. So shipbuilding in Welland is going to be closing up as a result of this Liberal government. So I hope members do more than heckle here. They should heckle in their caucus, Mr. Speaker. They should say, Prime Minister, stop this reckless cavalcade of spending. Stop raising taxes on small business, on farmers, Mr. Speaker. Stop raising taxes on businesses that are creating wealth and jobs, Mr. Speaker. So in this budget, where investment is mentioned 456 times, gender 358 times, Canadian Armed Forces 0, Mr. Speaker, it shows their priorities.